I'm going to jump into chapter 4. If you have Kohelet, we're going to be on verse 7 through 12, which is an interesting phrase. It does pick up with Bruce's question, which he keeps coming back to. Don't forget also that they spent a lot of time under the sun. And for them, the sun was not only the source of light, they didn't have electricity, but if you were in the Middle East, you spent a lot of time kind of baking under the sun. So perhaps that phrase comes from the environment and where he's living. All right, let's take a look at these verses, which I want to dive into. Basically, I've selected some snippets right from 4 through 12. And my goal is to try to keep us on target in terms of time and get to all of them. See how I do. B'shafti, I will share screen for those of you who don't have it, and you can follow along. B'shafti ani ve'er'eh hevel tachat hashemesh. Right, I went back to my normal theme, and I see that everything is fleeting, nothingness. We talked about this word, very hard to translate, but basically meaningless. Tachat hashemesh, under the sun, there's just nothing. You see that kind of depressed side to Kohelet. Maybe today we'll try to make some guesses as to who he is, what's going on in his life, and maybe what's there. I'm going to read some in English. The case of a man who is alone with no companion, who has neither son nor brother, yet he amasses wealth without limit, and his eye is never sated with riches. For whom now is he amassing it while denying himself enjoyment? That too is futility. V'inyan rahu, and it's a bad business or an unhappy business. So what do you see? What do you see in this verse, which might tell you something about Kohelet himself? We could make some guesses as to who he is and what's going on in his life. No companion. Some big clues here. Rachel, let's get you unmuted. Yeah, you're still on mute. You got to press the red button on the bottom left or the OK on your screen.
Okay. So a very lonely, isolated man, what is the word? I can't think of it. Anyway, clearly successful, amassing wealth, but clearly lonely, alone, absolutely alone.
Yeah.
And that's it. It's a misogynistic. I don't know, but he's
it's not misogynistic.
No. Okay, well, I don't know what the word means, but anyway, he is a sad character, very sad.
I think we can feel that sadness. He has no companion.
No.
Most people think that the companion refers to a male companion, not necessarily that he's married. Don't forget, often marriage was not really a companionship, but also he has no children. At least we can surmise that. So, Ibn Ezra calls this passage, calls Kohelet, kind of foolish for not taking a companion. And the commentators say that the companion is probably another adult male with whom he can study and talk and partner, right? What happens in the rabbinic period a few hundred years later, when you open up Pirkei Avot, you see this very clearly. Each of the rabbis has what?
A chavruta.
A chavruta. And that is the Jewish way. You're supposed to have a chavruta, a study partner, to bounce ideas off of back and forth. So,
But we don't know whether this man studies or not. He doesn't seem to study.
No, but it's also more than that. It's more. It brings out something that's, to me, I see everywhere, which is the need for community, the sense of community. So there are 25 of us here today listening to discussing that, and we have that sense of community, and that's very important.
Right. And it seems like he doesn't, I don't know if he doesn't study, because he does talk about, his learning and reading books, and we'll see that a little bit more. but he seems like he's unmarried, possibly a childless person with no one he can share his wealth into the future or inherit it. And he could maybe alleviate his loneliness through fellowship, through another person, through community, as Sam just said. And I think that, the benefits of the fellowship are, the Kohelet lists are, he might list them sometimes in not so valuable, in kind of a cheerless, state of affairs. But of course, they're really valuable. They ward off trouble. If it's a literal attacker, if you're feeling depressed, you can be picked up, and it changes your life. So I think that's what he's talking about. The Midrash talks about other kinds of companionship. One can be companions in Torah study, as we just talked about, a chavruta, and a third can be, it can be, well, let's get to the third, because there's a neat progression here. I'm just going to share screen again so you can follow along if you don't have the text. We go to a very famous section here. Tovim ashnayim min achad asher yesh lahem sachar tov be'amalam. Two are better than one in that they have greater benefit from their work. Amal is to work. And of course, you find this also in Proverbs. And you see this in a bunch of places. Further, when two lie together, they are warm. But how can he who is alone get warm? This can be literal or metaphoric. Also, if one attacks, two can stand up to an attacker. Then you have this key phrase, "Bechuta mishulash lo v'meira yinatek," a threefold cord, a threefold cord that is really wrapped up tight, cannot easily be broken. Think about a ship's knot. Think about, just a threefold relationship. A lot of scholars see this verse 9a, Tovim ashnayim asher min achad, and then down to 12b, the threefold cord, chuta mishulash lo v'meira yinatek. And so they see them as reconstructed as possibly one verse, or Kohelet splits it as a phrase that was known, and then adds his own commentary in the middle. Fox says, really interesting, that this was actually known in ancient civilization as a basic proverb, and it comes from the Babylonian epic that I mentioned earlier, Gilgamesh, which also reflects on 2 to 3 gradation, moving from a twofold strength, which is strong, but a threefold strength that is even stronger. And you can read it in Gilgamesh, quote, "Stop in Kitu," that becomes his friend. The second will not die. The towed boat will not sink. No one can ever sever a threefold cord. It's a really interesting phrase. And, it does make its way into our Jewish tradition. Does anyone know the ritual that involves a threefold cord? I'll give you a clue. Harold. Jump back onto mute.
Sorry, Havdalah candle?
Okay. So Havdalah candle can look like a threefold cord. Traditionally, it just has to have 2 flames interwoven as one. But I'm thinking of a daily ritual, Sunday through Friday, morning service. Big clues here. Donna.
Is the knot in the back of the tefillin?
So it is the tefillin, but I'm thinking of a different knot. How many times do we wind the tefillin around our middle finger?
3.
Times.
Right, once here, first knuckle, once to the second knuckle, back to the first, a threefold cord. So you're sort of saying, how intense is this tradition? And then the formula that you recite as you put on the 3 wrappings of your middle finger is, I betroth you to me forever. 1, I betroth you to me in justice and righteousness and compassion and loving kindness. I betroth you to me be'emunah, with faithfulness, with integrity. Then you shall come to know God. So it's interesting to see how the tradition made that popular. All All right, I'm going to jump up. Susan, yeah, please.
I wondered if the third is a child. That he has two together, and then he says to keep warm, which could easily be a euphemism for sex. And then he says there are three. Now we're a family of three, and nobody can break us apart.
Absolutely. Or even going back generationally, right? If you are so lucky to live and see your children and then your grandchildren, and you feel that kind of connection that goes through time. Yeah, all of that is very nice. Let's jump to number 5. Then he has a whole section about vows. You should fulfill them. I don't want to spend a lot of time there. You get a sense of how hardworking he is. He's a hardworking guy, sets a goal and he accomplishes it. Let's get to 5:12. I'm jumping here. 5:12. Here is a grave evil I have observed under the sun. Back to Bruce here. Everything is under the sun. Know that I have observed in the world. What's interesting about Kohelet is he is observant in the sense that he is looking around him and trying to make sense of the world around him. In that those riches are lost in some unlucky venture. If he happens to beget a son, he has nothing in hand because it'll be passed down. And clearly another indication that he doesn't have one, and so therefore he's not valuing it as much. Another grave evil is this. He must depart just as he came out of his mother's womb, so must he depart at last, naked as he came. He take nothing of his wealth with him. So what is the good of all this toiling for the wind? You get this fleeting nature. It's all getting blown away, dust in the wind. Besides, all his days he eats in darkness with much vexation and grief and anger.
Yeah.
Yeah, he gets frustrated by things in the world and he's just, drifts into his depression, drift into his frustration. I'm going to take you, Elizabeth, in 1 second. I want to finish 3 verses. Only this I have found is real good, that one should eat and drink, get pleasure with all the gains he makes under the sun during the numbered days of life that God has given him. A lot of predetermined things here.
Yeah.
That is his portion. Also, whatever a man is given riches and property by God, and is also permitted by him to enjoy them and take his portion and get pleasure for his gains, that's a gift of God. For such a man will not brood over the days of his life, maybe like he's saying I do, because God keeps him busy enjoying himself. All right, let's make some sense of this. Elizabeth, and then some others.
Well, I want to go back because just before this, it was the second time he mentioned about a son. The first time was when he was saying he had no companion and no son. But that doesn't mean he had no children because he doesn't mention whether he has a daughter. And then obviously at that time, daughters were not considered as the same as sons.
Okay, that's a nice reading. Obviously, we don't know the history. We're all just trying to guess a little bit at the text. I mean, the scholars have their own theories, but I consider all of us, just as good as the scholars. Judith.
Is it possible, this is like an ad for belonging to a synagogue and being part of a people. And was this put in here to show what life is like without being part of a covenant?
Your guess is as good as mine. The rabbis very much struggled with this text because here it says, eat and drink and do what you want. This
Right.
feels very close to a philosophy, a Greek philosophy that you may have heard of. What Greek philosophy am I referring to?
Hedonism.
Epicurus, maybe?
Yeah, kind of a form of hedonism. I was thinking of Epicureanism, right? The ancient school of Greek thought founded in Athens. We're about the year 307 before the Common Era, which would fit in nicely with this book coming shortly thereafter. It's based, of course, on the teachings of Epicurus. He was a materialist and following in the steps of Democritus, and his materialism led him to a general attack on superstition and divine intervention. So it's a little different than Kohelet, who sees everything set. You get this long to live. It's all been determined. But they might not be against a kind of an Epicurean philosophy that just enjoy life, pleasure's the highest good, mental pleasure was regarded even more than the physical pleasure. So you can see his intellectual pursuit as fitting into that. And the ultimate pleasure was to be held from freedom, anxiety, and mental pain. So that clearly had an influence on him. The rabbis then struggle with this because they don't subscribe to that theory. And when they're deciding about putting this book in or not, they feel like, come on, there's more to life than just go and enjoy your stuff. There's meaning, there's community, there's a moral system that undergirds everything in our tradition. And they wanted us to live up to that. That gets developed into concepts like tikkun olam, which we see in the second paragraph of the Aleinu, which is a text that comes to us a little bit later in Jewish sources. But if you're reading Hillel, if you're reading other people, the primary goal is to love your neighbor as yourself, right? You're supposed to connect with other people. You can see how this book is like, this doesn't really fit into it. Other thoughts on this before I'm going to jump to 6, Donna?
Except that if you look at the very end, it either has two authors or it was edited by the rabbis, because the ending line is the only thing is to revere God.
Hold on to that. That's my big crescendo, my big finale. So we're going to have to discuss that. I want to just make a couple of quick spots. So hold on to that, Donna. The ending certainly is the most mysterious part of the book. All right, I'm going to jump ahead to chapter 6, if that's okay. Someone else wanted to jump in for a sec?
I had one thought, and that is, this is a guy who earlier on has gone way out of his way to establish that everything is vanity, nothing really matters. And now he's saying, oh, except for all of these exceptions, which turn everything around. So it's almost as though he's arguing against himself.
Yeah. So let's take a look at a few more of those, building on what Marty just said. I'm going to 6-9. I'll share screen again as we bounce back and forth here. I like to see everyone, so I know it's harder when we're sharing screen. So 6-9 has this whole section, what advantage is the wise man over the fool? Again, you see he considers himself to be a wise man. But then he's like, fair. He didn't speak Yiddish, but right, he's like, do I really have anything over anyone else? Again, he comes back to, is the feasting of the eyes more important than the pursuit of desire? That too is futility and the pursuit of wind. What happens, it was designated a long time ago, and it was known that it would happen. As for man, he cannot contend with what is stronger than he. Again, you get this very much sense of the futility and that everything is predetermined. It goes on from there all the way to verse 12. Who can possibly know what is best for a man to do in his life? The few days of his fleeting life, for who can tell him what the future holds for him under the sun? So I wanted to focus on this phrase, is the feasting of the eyes more important than the pursuit of desire? And offer you a reading of that. Now this translation is a little tricky. There's no indication that this sentence is a question, which is the way JPS translates it, more than a statement. Some would translate it as follows. Let me read it. Quote, better the sight of the eyes than the wandering, literally the going. Look at that fourth word, mehalech nafesh, right? Better the sight of the eyes than the wandering, literally going of desire. This idea would fit in with Kohelet's principles very nicely. It's a typical better than. He does a lot of these. This is better than that. That's one of his key methods. He uses that in a bunch of places in the book. The sight of the eyes in the next verse, in that verse, is as in the next verse, is either what one sees or the experience of pleasure. The wandering of desire, mehalech nafesh, all of that is a yearning for something that someone doesn't possess. So if we're enjoying something, let's say we're having a good meal with friends, this is the sight of the eyes and it's good. But if we start thinking about other things we crave, a better meal, fancier food, perhaps more prestige or more success, more fame, sex, all
Annoying.
those things, then we lose contact with the actual place and moment. And our soul departs, as it was, mahalech nafesh, and wanders off to another place that isn't existent. And then the moment is depleted of meaning, and we have nothing. So what does this reading of Kohelet tell you that he's trying not to have you do? Right? What does he want you to do when you're in the moment?
You should be in the moment.
It says be in the moment. Barbara.
It's like mindfulness. Be where you are and appreciate it. And, don't keep looking for something better.
Right.
It's kind of a waste of time.
And I'll speak for myself, but often you're in one moment and suddenly you're thinking about the next moment or something else. Oh, I forgot to do the dishes. I don't know, or something that is just bothering you. And you suddenly leave the moment that you're in. And Kohelet shares a nice observation, which is that it's hard to stay in the moment. And it's hard to do that. That's why some of us practice mindfulness, meditation, and other things that sort of help us be in the moment. So I was really struck by this. I see some comments in the chat. I'm trying to also keep up with all of that. These are comments, I think, on the last piece. All right, let's keep going because we're doing well here. These last three verses, of course, are not liked by the rabbis, again, because everything's predetermined, and therefore you can't change. And for the rabbis, one of the key ideas of Judaism is the notion that you're not stuck in this endless loop, spring, summer, fall, winter, right? It just keeps going around and around. For the rabbis, one of the key ideas that is a revolution in ancient thought, or from ancient thought, is that you're not stuck in this endless loop, that you can perform tshuva. And that gets really developed by the rabbis into a whole process of transformation, of self-transformation. So they really didn't have a lot of, they didn't find a lot of favor in this whole part, and didn't want to see us as stuck. When you compare the book of Kohelet and Job, another one of the mysterious books of the Bible, although maybe not quite as mysterious because it mostly follows in a more straight line. Job thinks that if he could confront God, then maybe there could be some change. And if not change in God or the universe, then at least some kind of explanation. Whereas Kohelet's just like, it is what it is. You can't change. You're stuck. It's all Hevel. You really sink into his, at least if you really get into it, you sink into his depression a little bit.
How would you connect this with the Pirkei Avot? I forget which rabbi who said everything is foreordained, yet man has free will.
Well, that's one of the paradoxes that particular Pirkei Avot, because how do you have free will if everything's preordained?
Right.
I think that over time, the rabbis in the tradition start letting go of the predeterminist approach. So much so that by the time you get to the 11th century, 12th century, you get to a thinker like Gersonides, and Gersonides says God doesn't even know everything. And that's a radical statement. God cannot know future contingencies, because if God knows future contingencies, you can't have free will because it's already been determined and God knows it. The very knowledge of an electron already changes it according to physics. And so Gersonides is riffing off of that, not that he knew as much about electrons, he didn't know anything about electrons. But you see the metaphor between them. All right, I want to get to a couple of quick points before we get to our big finale. Let's jump to 7:15. Okay, we're now in chapter 7 as we're making our way through the text. This is kind of the greatest hits of Kohelet here. And 7:15, I liked Et hakol ra'iti bimei hevli. Yesh tzadik oved b'tziko v'yesh rasha ma'arich b'rato. In my own brief span of life, not exactly sure how old he is, but maybe he is in his midlife, which in those days was earlier than midlife today. I have seen both of these things. Sometimes a good person perishes in spite of their goodness, and sometimes a wicked one endures in spite of his wickedness. Harold Kushner made a lot of money. Well, not just a lot of money, but had a lot of, a lot to say about this. And why do bad things happen to good people? And what's interesting is he doesn't try to explain it like Harold Kushner does. He's just noting it. Look around the world, you'll see people who are really rotten, and they've accumulated massive wealth, power, all kinds of things.
Sure.
Sometimes someone who's fundamentally good is just has a life filled with service. And he doesn't say anything, but you can feel like any of us. It's just like frustrating to him. And that's what I feel there. All right, I'm going to jump around with a few more texts here because I want to get to the big finale. I'm very excited for that. 7:26, you get a line that's negative about women. Obviously, there were some misogynistic things in the air, certainly 2,200 years ago. Now I find women more bitter than death. Oof. All traps, her hands are fetters, and her heart is snares. He who is pleasing to God escapes her, and he who is displeasing is caught by her. Ouch. We'll just leave this as a misogynistic statement and place it in the context of the world. Chapter.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
Rabbi, that's sort of consistent with his whole theme here. There is a weariness that's intertwined with all of his observations. He's been deprived of whether by on purpose or by fate. He's been deprived of one of the things that from most people makes life not just worthwhile, but to be treasured. The relationship that is so essential to a household and bringing up a family and so forth. I mean, it's just that he obviously was impoverished in spirit in a way that most of us can't share. We can observe, but can't. I'm glad we can't share it, frankly.
Yeah. Over to Art and then Tony.
Rabbi, I know you are trying to move quickly through the text, but when back on 15, the bad things happen to good people and vice versa. I mean, his punchline is remarkable. You don't overdo goodness, don't overdo wickedness, grasp one without letting go of the other. What's that all about?
Well, since you're not going to get rewarded for the goodness, and I don't see you saying anything, he's kind of saying I don't really have an explanation for any of this. And therefore, it goes back to his statement, enjoy what you can. And I don't really see any meaning to life. And, coming back to what Harvey just said, he is suffering from, I could psychoanalyze him, or my wife could, but he is, he's suffering from some kind of depression. So I see that, don't overdo it, because that's just going to lead you even to more trouble. But I just see a lot of just resignation in that text. At least that's the way I'm reading it, Art. that he's a little bit resigned to the state of affairs that he sees. And even though he has accumulated wealth, and often we see this sometimes, people who have accumulated a lot of wealth, but they're not living happy. If I read the happiness surveys, it's actually people who have less things are often happier than people who have more things. And I think Kohelet already, thousands of years ago was aware of that. I don't know if that's a
Moderation.
good explanation, but I'll leave it at that. Rose and then Tony.
Moderation in all things.
Right, so he does find that, although we're going to see in a few verses, he's like, enjoy your youth, party on. I see nothing better, so get out there and drink. We'll get to that in one moment in chapter 9. Over to Tony. Tony, you need to unmute.
Some of the interpretations say that this misogynist view of women is really talking about seductresses or stranger women who take advantage of their wiles in order to lead men into evil. And in Alter, he says in Wisdom, memorably in Proverbs 5 and 7, they talk about that. So of course, it doesn't sound like he's had much positive experience with women. So as Harvey said, it's kind of sad for him, but.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of commentary building on what you just said, Tony. In other places, think about the book of Proverbs, which talks about a strange or forbidden woman who can entrap a man in adultery. So clearly, there's some negative thinking here. But here he asserts that all women are like that. Anyway, it's not the only such remark in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible. But he's clearly giving a little bit of a hyperbolic statement. But let's leave it at that. All right,
Even in modern times, parents find their teenage daughters being attracting guys that are not very.
Oh yeah, right.
And they are doing this. I mean, it's even in modern day we have this issue.
Right. Although I think Kohelet is painting with a very broad brush.
Oh yeah, he's much.
Thing. All right, I've got a couple more to do, at least that I wanted to. So again, chapter 8, I'm going to just have to skip over. He talks about more things being predetermined. And oh, by the way, we're all going to die. So, in case you forgot that. And then chapter 9:7. I wanted to jump to chapter 9, verse 7, if you're able to jump ahead. This is nice because it is, in fact, makes its way into a number of places. Go eat your bread in gladness and drink your wine in joy, for your action was long ago approved by God. This is kind of a little bit more of a positive sense. Again, it has this enjoy everything for this moment theme that we see, but a little bit nicer because God is kind of approved of your action. Does anyone know where this is used in the liturgy? A little trickier piece. It is used in the Yom Kippur liturgy. Towards the end of the day of Yom Kippur, in the Ne'ilah service, we've kind of made it through the fast, and there is a piyut, one of these beautiful religious poems, that this is the refrain. We use this in our eulogies for my dad, right? Who loved, had a joie de vivre, and loved, to eat and drink and enjoy that. The idea of it's long ago approved by God feels a little bit different than the book, which kind of said you might as well enjoy. Here it feels a little bit more connected to God and therefore a little bit more positive. But it's a nice phrase. If you're interested, look in our Machzor Lev Shalem. If you have it, there's a beautiful poem that has this refrain as we're coming out of Yom Kippur and really gearing up to break the fast. And like we've done a good job, God approves of it, we've been forgiven, and now we're ready to enjoy coming out of Yom Kippur. And there's a certain energy there. All right, I think I'm building. Yeah, Tony.
Well, the very next line, at least in the altar, is enjoy life with a woman whom you love all your days of mere breath that have been given to you under the sun. So there he is talking very positively about a woman. So he's all over the place.
He is all over the place. Does this mean he once had a love? Did she break his heart? And therefore he was disappointed. It's a strange verse. That is a sui generis verse that you don't see in the rest of the text.
Rabbi, maybe he didn't write it all in one sitting and he didn't have an editor.
Right. So he clearly didn't have an editor because there's no logical flow back and forth. And don't forget, sometimes these texts were copied over time and the scribes just said, they moved things around. They didn't understand what was going on. So and sometimes they merely miscopied columns of text. But yeah, he's all over the place, which might reflect our own lives. As I said in the first class, sometimes you're up and sometimes you're down. Steve?
Yeah, I just thought it is interesting that he recognizes the authority in the sense of God as sort of approving of that. In 729, I thought it was interesting that he doesn't trust reason. He was really saying that thinking about this is not a way out. You're not going to figure this out.
Right. That feels very much like Job. But it's interesting. He is a guy who
the only question I really have is why the heck
he's thinking. Like he is thinking. And he's trying to make sense. And in the end, you just kind of feel like he's throwing up his hands. But I think his mood does shift. As he has different moments in his life and he sits down and is writing this maybe over time as and he as Harold just said, as Harvey just said, he's writing in a good moment. Imagine someone who has a journal and then the next day he's like, what am I doing? All right, chapter 11. Let's I want to get to the end because we have a lot of fun. Chapter 11 is living with uncertainty. I'll just jump to verse 9 because it really leads into the end of the book. I'll share screen again. Am I still sharing screen? I can't even remember if I'm sharing or not sharing. It goes so fast. Okay, I'm sharing screen. Verse 9. Sameach bachur biyaldutecha. O youth, enjoy yourself while you are young. Let your heart lead you to enjoyment in the days of your youth. Follow the desires of your heart and the glances of your eyes. You can see the rabbis were like, whoa, slow down there, Kohelet. This is getting a little out of control. Follow the glances of your eyes, but know well that God will count you to account for all such things. I love that line because which way is it, right? You see something that attracts you, go after it. Have some good drink. Party on, Wayne, live it up. And then all of a sudden, he's like, but it's coming back to you. Don't get carried a little bit too much. All right, chapter 12 starts with the aging body. So while he says, party on in your youth, just know that things are not going to work out so well, which gives you the sense that he's getting older and his body is starting to fail him. And that things are changing. We've got all of these metaphors. The scholars really struggle with making sense of verses 1 through 8. Silver cord snaps, the jar is shattered at the spring, and the dust returns to the ground as it was, and the life breath returns to God. And then sums it all up in verse 8. Utter futility, said Kohelet, utter futility. And then suddenly, we have a change in the text. Fasten your seatbelts for the big finale. Bikesh Kohelet limso. Now, no longer is he speaking, but someone speaking about him.
Yeah.
And there are, of course, different theories. Let me read it first, and then I'll present you with a couple of theories about this epilogue, which is very unclear to the scholars, perhaps to us as well. Kohelet sought to discover useful sayings and recorded genuinely truthful sayings. It's almost like a defense of the book. He was really trying to come up with ideas. The saying of the wise are like goads, like nails fixed in prodding sticks. They were given by one shepherd, presumably by God. A further word, against them, my son, be warned. The making of many books is without limit, and much study is a wearying of the flesh. You can see the rabbis had problems with this because they loved studying and they loved books. So what are you doing, Kohelet? Or whoever is editing this last epilogue here, and what are they saying? The sum of the matter. All right, let's sum it all up, even though you can't sum it up because Kohelet's been all over the radar. The sum of the matter is, when all is said and done, revere God and observe his commandments. For this applies to all humankind, that God will call every creature to account for everything unknown, be it good or bad. The sum of the matter, when all is said is done, revere God and observe his commandments, for this applies to all mankind. How on earth do we make sense at the end of the book, given the other 12 and a half chapters? And we need to start coming up with ideas. There's lots and lots of ideas. I mean, first of all, who wrote this? Donna, start us off.
Yeah, well, I come back to what I thought of when I spoke before, that when the rabbis put it in the Bible, they had to edit it to make sense of what he was saying that they didn't approve of, and came to this conclusion.
Right. So let's start with the traditional reading. The traditional reading is, oi, this book is a problem. The rabbi said, but we like it. It's got some wisdom. We also feel there's some lack of purpose in the world. Maybe they already had a tradition that people were quoting from it, and so they didn't want to leave it out because it had already gained some popularity. So they have to come up with an ending. And so there's an anonymous teacher who's now speaking, perhaps as one of the readings. And now he's addressing the reader as my son. Okay, right? Look what he says, verse 12. Against them, my son, be warned. So he's now warning his son. Obviously, it doesn't have to be literally his son. This is sometimes a typical formula in wisdom literature. And now he's speaking about Kohelet in the third person and treating him as a personage of the past. It's not like he's in the book anymore. And then his teachings are admired a little bit, okay? Which is why, again, the book makes the cut. But listen, you better be careful with this book. Certainly this voice has some hesitation. Now, don't forget the traditional commentators all see this book as being written by Solomon, as it says in the beginning. So then maybe you have to assume that this part is him, just kind of stepping onto the balcony, reflecting on his book. Now, since the 19th century, all the traditional commentators, in the 19th century said, since it speaks about Kohelet, it was clearly added by a later editor, as we just said, to smooth out the rough edges. But right in this editor, of course, would see his words as too unorthodox, too dangerous, and therefore we better just tap it down with a big ending. Just one other theory that I'll give, and then I'll open it up. Some recent studies have said that the epilogue was actually spoken by the narrator of the book, who presents the wisdom of Kohelet, supposedly an ancient sage, by quoting it extensively. And then the author of this epilogue, right, whose view is pretty final and decisive and kind of summarize what the author of the book is saying, He's looking back on Kohelet while summarizes his work, while showing respect then for Kohelet. This apologist or epiloguist, keeps a certain distance from the teaching and from all recorded wisdom literature. All these words of the wise are fine and good, but you got to handle them a little bit carefully, almost, gingerly and very, delicately. He's not repudiating Kohelet, but he's reminding you there's some dangerous stuff here and be a little bit careful with it. The postscript, that verse about the sum of the matter is when all is said and done, revere God, observe his commandments, right? This is in fact reminding us that wisdom originates in human intellect and tradition, but of course it takes second status to doing the mitzvot and a life of piety. It's interesting. We've had this whole book of thoughts, but don't get too carried away in your thoughts. Judaism is a tradition of action. And that's, by the way, how we've seen it. Jews, as juxtaposed to Christianity, have said, you can think all kinds of stuff, but what you think about, at the end of the day, as long as you put on your tefillin, do the mitzvahs, you'll be okay, which is interesting. All right, let's go around. I saw a bunch of hands, starting with Steve.
It's kind of interesting, how we learned that the characters in the Torah, they're not all admirable. They're human. We can connect with them. And in the Talmudic tradition, we preserve both sides of an argument or all sides of an argument. Why shouldn't we have unreliable narrators in the wisdom literature too?
There you go. Maybe this fits in very nicely, assuming it could, by the way, it could all be within Kohelet. He's like, you know what? I give up with all this stuff. Just do the tradition. I'm all mixed up, and we'll leave it at that. Georgia.
I find this book uplifting because it legitimizes asking questions. And that really has become in later generations. If you ask what, kind of relates to us, this very much does.
I love that reading. And I think that's what's happened to the book of Kohelet, is it becomes a form of literature that is more popular over time, that someone can kind of step onto the balcony, look at their life and look at their experiences. I'm thinking of some early Christian thinkers like, who am I thinking of?
St. Augustine.
Yeah, thank you. Augustine. That's exactly what I was thinking of, right? Who's able to have this kind of reflection. And I think for us as modern, Jews, modern thinkers, modern people, that is in fact what we do sometimes. Over to Rose.
The Sepharia, the Sepharia English translation repeats verse 13 without noting that, so that the actual end is that God will call every creature to account for everything unknown, be it good or bad. Which is a different feel, I think. But also Candide and the end that we must cultivate our garden because there's nothing else. Or I'm also reminded of the end of the first book of the Forsyte saga, when her world has been destroyed and there's nothing left to do but kind of go back to where she had been.
So I love that reading. First of all, just a note about the verses. Since it ends with such a negative thing that God will call everyone to account, the rabbis say, whoa, we never end a book with a negative thing. They do the same thing with the Haftarah. They always change it. And that's why in Eicha we go back to the penultimate verse. And here they go back to the penultimate verse. So you cannot end on too negative a point. They always want to give you a little something hopeful to kind of lift you up. And I think, for many of us, sometimes we're thinking, and I'll speak for myself, I get lost in who created God and what's the point of the universe and why does the universe exist? And I could start, spinning into a kind of a rabbit hole of all different thoughts. And I just stop and say, you know what? I don't know. Let's just go to shul and I'll worry about that another time. Some other thoughts as we make our way around the room and sum up the book. Over to Lou.
It another way of understanding the book, besides the idea that's a dialogue, is that Kohelet is trying to really walk a very fine line between Epicureanism and what I'll call proto-rabbinic, because this is all pre-rabbinic, and this is the first encounter really of Judaism with Greek philosophy, and it seems like it took. Well, I'm not sure we've ever quite finished the process, but we certainly took hundreds of years of arguing and may very well have contributed to the schisms in Judaism pre-Christianity, how to deal with this. And Kohelet is, it's like he's on a fence and occasionally falls off to one side or the other.
I think that's a beautiful reading. And, certainly he is straddling those two worlds. And he's trying to make sense of it and the thoughts. And also he's very much someone who is, just aware of what he sees and brings that into the equation. A lot of philosophers were really just building on what they had read, the ideas that they were thinking about in their minds in terms of ideas, but not in terms of what they were witnessing in reality. I think that's what makes him a rich thinker, is that he is looking around him and trying to make sense of the world. I don't know that in the end he makes sense, but he makes, I think, a lot of observations. I saw a few more hands go up around the room, trying to get to everyone. We'll start with Donnie and then over to Harvey.
I feel like I just put this comment in the text. I feel like I just read a dialogue between two people, or maybe more, but each arguing his own view. And then the other one says, but no. I like the points they raise. I like the focus they bring to looking at all the sides and the discussion. And life is futile. No, it isn't.
Right. So what's interesting is that while you feel like it's a dialogue, it may in fact be his dialogue with himself.
Yeah.
And it may in fact just be one person. Over to Harvey. Let's get you unmuted, Harvey. Harvey, you got to press the OK button in the middle of your screen.
There, I unmuted. I didn't realize I'd been remuted, Rabbi. Anyway, that's exactly the point that I was going to make. As we would have been talking towards the end, what I was reminded of is the image of a group of rabbis discussing text, and one says something and the others say, you're right. And then somebody says the opposite and they say, you're right.
I think there's a whole genre of Jewish humor that comes out of this book. Over to Elizabeth.
It reminds me of Tevye. On the one hand, on the other hand.
On the other hand, right.
Yeah, it's very Jewish. He's the original Tevye. Although I don't think he has, it doesn't seem like he has the family and the relationships like Tevye's rich relationship with Golda. I think he's missing, a whole aspect of life that it seems not to be there. Sandy.
I think in a way, though, he's going back and forth, for at least looking at it in modern times, is for us. So as I look at him doing both, I'm just speaking personally, as I look at him doing both of these, this inner dialogue, then the question is to me, like, Sandy, will you feel both these things? What do you do with that? And then I go back to Judith's comment of, is this an ad for joining a shul? Or like, well, at the end of the day, I can't think about this. I'm just gonna go to this meeting or go to the minyan. So I feel like he's opened something up that for me, all these millennia later, I have to figure out, what do I do with both those things, both those poles?
Yeah, nice. Some others who want to sum this up as we close up Kohelet. You will get to come back to it since we read it every year on Sukkot. So you're not leaving it forever. 6 months from now, we'll be back in Kohelet. So he will remain your friend. Michael Fox has a beautiful summary that I thought I would share as we close out. That Kohelet is not a nihilist. Everything is absurd. Akol Hevel is to be understood as expressing a general characterization of life, not an absolute proposition negating all possible activities and values. As well as tearing down, Kohelet is building up, showing you how we can recover and reconstruct some meaning. He doesn't arrive at a grand logic or theology or some all-encompassing approach that makes sense of everything. He recommends modest or small-scale accommodations in our individual life. He finds some things worthwhile: moderate work, temperate enjoyment of the pleasures that come to hand, love and friendship, gaining and using whatever wisdom is within our capacity, being reasonably righteous, fearing God, and hoping for some divine justice. These are our portion and should be embraced, even if they don't constitute a yitron, a prophet, by Kohelet's very rigorous standards, and even if they are contaminated by the absurdity that pervades our world. These valuable things are brief, maybe limited and uncertain, but they are enough to make life worth living. And thus Kohelet comes to realize that despite all of its unfairness and all of its absurdity, all of its hevel that he keeps coming back to, that life itself is still good. It's to be grasped all the more eagerly for its brevity, given death's finality. We saw that in chapter 9, verse 7 through 10, and 11, verse 7. His affirmations, all the things that he sees as worthwhile, all kind of look inward to the individual's benefit. I think that's why the book doesn't fit in with most of Judaism, which sees, right, the value of the community as principle. Right? Judaism is a communitarian approach in the way that it evolves, very different from America today, which is, or America for most of our history, which is individualism is paramount. He doesn't not tell us to pursue justice, though he sees injustice, and I think that's a shortcoming. Most of the tradition would say, when you see injustice, as I spoke about in my sermon yesterday, you have to speak out. And if you don't, then you're in essence not following the thrust of the Torah. He does not tell us to do basic things, comfort the oppressed, though he sees their discomfort. I think this is obviously a real shortcoming of Kohelet. His concerns are internal. What troubles people, what troubles himself, what cheers up people, how they can get along in a world which is as much determined but also opaque. There are practical things we can do, according to him, that reduce the risks. But the only realm of freedom and control is the human heart, the realm of your own emotions, thoughts, and attitudes. We are to enjoy whatever pleasures that God has made possible and to avoid whatever sorrow we can look away from. This, we may note, is a Stoic doctrine. And I think for us today, while we often drift into that in our own, perhaps emotional life, in our own philosophical thinking, this is lacking something that we find very precious. And that in the connection with other people, in the comforting of the oppressed, in the pursuit of justice, in working for and connecting and helping other people, we find a much more profound value. And in that sense, I feel bad for Kohelet, who missed out on all those aspects of life and was really missing something fundamental and a core. That isn't to negate his teachings, because I think he also speaks to a real human experience that many of us encounter, certainly at various points in our lives. But I think it's one part of a puzzle. And when you take it with the other pieces of the Tanakh, of rabbinic literature, the way they've developed today, then you can see it as one part, but not the totality. So I want to thank all of you for coming out, sharing your insights, reading the book. And it's a very rich text, and hopefully unpacking it, seeing it as a mysterious book of the Bible, one hopefully that is a little less mysterious, and one that you can now put it into your pocket, so to speak, and you can say, I have some clue, I have a handle on this book, and then continue to appreciate its poetry, its insights, and its certain outlook, even if it's lacking in some parts. So I wish everyone a Chag Kasher v'Sameach as we're gearing up for Pesach. This, of course, is the wrong book for Pesach, when we'll be reading Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, which is gorgeous love poetry. So enjoy that, and enjoy the whole festival where there's much to learn. And I think a whole different theology for Pesach, which is we were redeemed, and therefore we live in a world that we are asked and invited to be God's hands in the redemption. And that, to me at least, feels like a much more positive and resonant theology. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
Rabbi.
Rabbi. Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Chag Sameach, everyone.